Welcome to another episode of Sitting with God on the Brink of Eternity. I want to talk tonight about servanthood and salvation perspectives. This will be a little different lesson, and yet what happened in the hospital made me think of it quite a lot. As important as servanthood is, and it is the crux to me of God. I mean, He is the servant of servants, not just the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And so, servanthood, He said, is what makes you the very greatest. But as important as servanthood is, it does not change what the Bible says about salvation. A year ago or so, I wrote the shortest book that I've ever written, entitled, God, Are We Good? And the subtitle was, Can I Know for Sure? What prompted me to write that is the fact that I have many friends and relatives, people that I talk with about God, who have very little idea of what the Bible actually says. And so the common prevailing opinion is that everyone's okay. If you love them, and if they ever did anything good, and if they've ever said Jesus' name once, then they must be fine with God. And so mainly their opinions about it come from other people's opinions, not from studying out the Bible on their own. And so I felt like if I could write a book, I could give to people, ask them to read it. It's short, and we could then have some meaningful dialogue about what the Bible actually says, because I quote many passages in the book itself. But one thing I know for sure is Jesus was quite clear about the path that leads to heaven. He said in Matthew 7:13 and 14, that it is a narrow way that leads to heaven, and few find it. And then there is a broad way that leads to hell, and most are on it. That's a disturbing passage. I dare say that most people who feel like they're okay with God don't even know that passage is in the Bible. And so writing the book was my intent to help people dig in a bit into the Bible for themselves and find out that Jesus is asking a lot more of them, asking a lot more of their life than they really understand or are aware of. And so that was the purpose behind the book. And I've given the book to a lot of people. I've written letters with it when I have mailed it to relatives and friends that I don't normally get to talk with. But at any rate, that was the purpose of the book. But I got down in the book to a certain spot where I went through the book of Acts and talked about how to get right with God, how to be saved. And following that, I wrote 2 chapters about growing tensions in the air. Or maybe I titled it Tensions in the Air. And so I talked about the fact that I feel some tensions in dealing with certain people spiritually because of their life. They have some teachings that they understand differently than I do. But when I look at their life, they're living a very dedicated, committed life, and they love God and they love Jesus. Those people bring some tension to me because of my background and because of my knowledge of the Bible. I was raised in what I call the mainstream churches of Christ, and we were definitely a very doctrinally oriented group. We were concerned about having the right view of everything, especially something as important as salvation. And so it was with that background that I later wrote my first book entitled Prepared to Answer. It was based on a statement that Peter made, but it is talking about being prepared to answer what the Bible is saying on any given topic, especially topics that you would say are highly important in our relationship with God and our understanding of that relationship with Him. I wrote the book in 1995. I later added some chapters to it, changed some parts of it a bit, some minor editing. I did take some of the edginess off of it that I had in places and came out with a second edition back in about 2009 or 2010. But I believe everything I wrote in the book. I haven't changed my mind about what is in that book. And I believe that doctrine is very important, and yet I know that life is very important. The Bible is clear about the fact that we need to have our life and our doctrine lined up with God's will. It's sort of like the two wings of an airplane. They both need to be there, both our life and our doctrine. And so in the book, I address both sides of that, but the tension comes up when I'm dealing with someone that seems to be very dedicated to God, very dedicated to Jesus, really trying hard to please Him, and yet they hold to some doctrines, some teachings that I think are amiss, especially when it comes to how we are saved. What is the conversion process? So, in the first of the chapters dealing with tensions in the air, I talked about some friends of mine, some people that have talked with me, some leaders who have talked to me, and they have expressed concerns about this very thing. The ones that are not dedicated, they clearly are violating passages like Luke 9, denying yourself, taking up your cross daily, following Christ, giving up your life for Him. And then in Luke 14, it talks about giving up everything for Him. There are people that are clearly not doing anything about those passages. They are not on their radar at all. Those kinds of people, I think, are on the broad road that leads to the wrong place. It bothers me for them, but it doesn't bother me in any way causing me any tension because the Bible is so very clear on those topics. On the other hand, there are topics that there are differences on. And when I see people very dedicated that have a different view on those topics, it concerns me. And it concerned the three leaders who talked with me about it. And they had specific teachings that we've done that they had a question about, wanted to know what my take was on those things. And so we talked about the thief on the cross. All this is in the book. But we talked about the thief on the cross that amounted to something like a deathbed confession, but he knew who Jesus was. He knew he was innocent. When you read all the accounts about the thief on the cross, he had no question about Jesus being innocent and not deserving what they deserved, the two thieves. And so on that one, we've often said in the passage where the man was lowered down the roof, from the roof, and Jesus told him to take up his mat and walk, and said that his sins were forgiven, which disturbed the Pharisees very much. But Jesus said on that account that I want you to know that I have the authority on earth to forgive sins. And so one of my friends said that God still has that same authority. Jesus still has that same authority in heaven. And so he may decide to save someone like the thief on the cross that doesn't meet all the requirements that we think are in the Bible, that we see in the Bible and understand in that way. There are examples that I give, and I'll put some of this in print outside the book at a later time. But at any rate, I look at people like that, and it does cause me some tensions. Now, on the other hand, the next chapter in the book is the other side of the coin. Knowing what I know about what the Bible teaches about the process of salvation, coming into a relationship with God initially, what I know about that, I could not possibly be on the side of some of my friends. I have a very good friend that I fish with, and we've discussed a number of different doctrines. He's actually changed his mind on one that we've shared about together. but he hasn't changed his mind on all the ones that we differ on. And so that causes me tension because I see in him a real dedication to spiritual things. We'll keep discussing those doctrines, I'm quite sure, but it does cause me some tension. On the other hand, if I were in his position or in the position of someone that takes a different view of the conversion process, I couldn't live with it. I know too much Bible. I know too many ways to explain how it all fits together for me possibly to take the other view. So I explain in the book the tensions that I would feel if I were on that side. But the parts that I know are true are the ones that have to do with the life that we're living. For example, in Galatians 5, he says, you need to produce the fruit of the Holy Spirit, and he describes that fruit. And then he says there is the works of the flesh, the old versions say, or the acts of the sinful nature in the newer versions. And he lists out the sins, the acts of the flesh, and he says, if you live like this, you can't be saved. There's no missing this point. Listen to this. Galatians 5:19-21. He says, the acts of the flesh are obvious. Sexual immorality, that's sex outside marriage, period. Impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, when I was in the hospital, there was a marriage retreat going on in Dallas that my good friends Roger and Marcia Lamb were conducting. I was in the hospital, so not there, obviously. But a sister in our region of ministry region made up a big banner, had it printed up. Erin is her name. She had it printed up and then had people at the marriage retreat sign it and had nice little things to say about praying for me and loving me and all of those things. My daughter by marriage, Joy, put that up in my room in a very prominent place. It was a large banner, about 6 foot by maybe 2 foot or 3 foot, whatever it was big. And so when people came in, they saw that banner. And so it led us into conversations. I shared my faith so many times with so many people, but I found out there are a lot of spiritually minded people on planet Earth, especially in Texas. And so people wanted to talk about spiritual things. I was amazed at how many actually wanted to pray with me, for me. I remember, and the students who were coming in to interview you, the last two who came in, a young man and a young woman, the young woman started talking with me about spiritual things after seeing the banner. And she said that she was a part of the campus ministry of the medical school there, and that she had just been on a mission to South Texas. And so we talked for a little while. And before she left, she said, could I pray with you? And I said, sure. And she came over and held both my hands and prayed a prayer that was probably one of the most spiritual ones I'd heard in a long time. It was quite impressive. And so that kind of experience that kept happening to me made me realize there are a lot of people who are serious about Jesus. There are a lot of people that may be in a different setting than I am as far as their spiritual life goes and their church and so forth, but they are definitely very serious about it. And so when I wrote the book, I did not write a conclusion to it, which we normally call an epilogue. But sometime after I wrote the book, I wrote what I called a postscript. That's what you write after a letter. You think of something else, and so you put PS on it and you add something. I added a section to the book I called a postscript. And in that postscript, I raised some questions that I thought that people of my background and persuasion needed to think about. I'll give you a brief quote from the postscript. I say, broadly speaking, sin is breaking God's laws in our personal life and in holding and or teaching erroneous doctrinal beliefs. Life and doctrine are both important. And so after talking about all the forgiveness that we believe God gives us on the life side of it, then I picked up and talked about the doctrinal side. So here goes the rest of the quote. Moving over to the sins of a doctrinal nature, are we now in a different arena where God's grace is no longer quite so amazing? We base our hope for heaven not on our performance, but on God's grace, a grace that shapes our desires to please Him and determines the directions of our lives. Thus, His mercy shows itself in our lives as desire and direction rather than performance and perfection. Will His grace motivating that same desire and direction be sufficient to overcome sins of a theological, doctrinal nature? And so that is the way that I sort of closed out the book, just raising the question that we need to think about that. God may go a different direction than you think He will on that side of the coin, and I think we need to think about it. One of the guys that believes as I do about the conversion process was talking to me about this, and he's a very conservative fellow, very much so. Older guy, he's even older than I am, if I recall correctly. But we were talking one day, and he, in his job, is a professor. He is around Christian universities, religious universities. So he's around people, and he said, he said, some of these people I'm around, their life, their convictions about God, their love for God. He said, I actually feel more akin to them than to people that may be with me in service at the same church on Sunday. And so he said, I have hope for these people who have some different doctrinal convictions than I do. He says, I have hope for them, but I don't feel free to give them hope. I don't feel free, in other words, to tell them you're okay like you are. He said, I have to teach what I believe the Bible says, but I still have hope that on the day of judgment, there will be grace to cover some of these differences that we have in doctrinal beliefs. And so I have used that for a long time as sort of a mantra for me. I am not the judge. I am glad that I'm not the judge. Pardon me. God is the judge. And if He goes in some different directions than I thought, that's up to Him. All I can do and all I will do the rest of my life is teach exactly what I believe the Bible to teach to those in my church and those out of my church. I'm not going to change what the Bible says, but I am very grateful that it is all up to God on the day of judgment. And so I am thankful and encouraged to interact with anyone who loves my Jesus. Okay, this is the second segment of this episode. And as is our custom, we have a guest, and this is a very special guest. All of our guests are special. They're all in the church where I go, and they're just ordinary Christians. But that means to me they're extraordinary, because anyone trying to be a Christian in this day and age, to me, is extraordinary. But this one happens to have a name very much like mine. His name is Bryce Ferguson. So this is my eldest grandson. who made me a granddad 24 plus years ago. He's a graduate of University of Texas at San Antonio in business. He works in the financial part of a law office, and it happened to be close to the hospital where I was. And so he came by to see me almost every day to encourage me, which was great, and spent one long afternoon and night with me. And we watched all our sports things. So, anyway, he's my grandson, but he's a sharp dude. And so I asked him to be a part of this, and he makes the whole age thing better because I got enough old here with me, and so I get young people to be on here. And so Bryce, thanks for being on here, bud.
It's good to be here. We should name this Gordon Ferguson times 2 because this doesn't happen very much. So
yeah, okay.
yeah,
GF times 2.
yeah, GF times 2.
But based on the presentation of the episode there, what questions do you have for me?
Well, I know that this discusses into the book, God, Are We Good? Which in reality it is, and also you do mention that it is the shortest book you've written. And I think when I read it, it took a few days to about a week. It was a quick read. Was that your intention, that you said, I'm going to make this book and it will be the shortest?
Yes. In fact, I wanted it to be even shorter, but I got input from a couple of people. Jeannie Shaw read it. Michael Burns read it. They gave some input. I lengthened it a little bit. And then when you're writing, you think of things, I really should include this. And so, and then my publisher, Tony, used smaller print than I wanted him to. So that was the first thing I called him about. This thing's too hard to read, it's small print.
Yeah.
But I wanted it to be short to try to get people to read it that I thought wouldn't read it unless it was probably fairly brief, and hopefully the title and the chapter titles and all that would grab their attention.
Right. Yeah. And we do notice that people are kind of recommending that book to their neighbors. And I think a big, not really selling point, but it is enticing and incentivizing when it is that length. Would you say that it's, you're not giving them this gigantic book, it could overwhelm them? I would also ask, how would you describe it to someone who has no knowledge of the Bible? Maybe just a little bit, maybe they've been to church when they were young, but they don't really fully fathom or understand what it is to have a relationship with God.
Okay.
Because this book could and will be very, moving to them if they do it. But, it's tough to kind of just dive into pieces of literature when you don't know too well about it to begin with.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Very good question. I think the way I try to describe it is that I often use myself as an example and say that I grew up going to church. My mom made me. I didn't want to go, but my mom made me.
Me too.
But at any rate, I grew up and was in church, but I didn't learn much about the Bible. And so later in life, when I started actually trying to study the Bible more, I was more than shocked at some things I saw in there. And I realized that what I had heard from other people were merely their opinions, but not what the Bible actually said. So I try to get into it that way and explain that there are basics that we need to know. It's kind of like going to a doctor and finding out how things are physically, or going to a financial person, finding out how our finances are. This is designed to help us take a spiritual inventory, but hopefully an easy one to take that's not too long, but it does cover the real basics that are important. And so I ask people to read it, and then we can talk more about it. I can answer questions you have, etc. But I wrote it for that purpose, and I mailed it out to a lot of relatives and friends that I don't get to talk to. And so if they'll read it, then we can talk. And so I've had some follow up with those that I've mailed out, and other follow up with some that I have given out.
Right. Yeah, it has gone out a lot to friends and family. When, this whole topic that this covers talks about salvation, and it's a heavy word because there's so much definitions to it. There's so many ideas, interpretations.
Right.
But in essence, how would you define salvation? Because it's good to know, and it's good to define things, because from there you can kind of delve into multiple subjects that's easier to understand. So
Okay.
from your personal experience, how would you describe it or
Uh,
define it?
that's a good question too, for the reasons noted that you say, because people have different ideas of what words mean. So I talk about basically how we get right with God,
Mm-hmm.
so that when we meet Him, we're right with Him, we spend eternity with Him. So being saved is being saved spiritually in a way that leads to eternity with God,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. Sometimes I use the word conversion or the conversion process. What is the process by which we get converted to become a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
So those are ways that I go about explaining it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that kind of stems into this next question. The whole um, idea and the whole principle of watching your life and doctrine closely.
Mm-hmm.
That was, I remember when I was studying the Bible, that was
Mm-hmm.
the one thing that I couldn't really understand, the analogy of the plane with wings.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense now, but at the time it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, how would you kind of l- advise someone, or, to watch their life and doctrine closely? In other ways, if they're asking, what does that mean and how
Mm-hmm.
does it look?
Okay,
How would you go into that?
good. Well, it's good. One reason I like to have younger people is because your generation and the younger generations in general tend to even look at the questions differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so on this one, the the word life and doctrine, actually the word doctrine is from a Greek word that simply means teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so watch your life and your teaching. And the bulk of the teaching part is actually how to live life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not theological or something like that so much. It's more how do you live life? What is the right teaching to follow?
Mm-hmm.
But then there are subjects that are more theological in nature. And so they are a different type of doctrine. And the Bible deals with those as well. There are things that are called false doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Those especially are addressed in the New Testament and the Old, but
Mm-hmm.
say the New Testament. There are teachings that are just false about the nature of God, the kinds of things we should be doing. And so, whereas the Bible tells you to live a moral life, there were some, even in the church, that justified and taught that doing immoral things was okay and God would accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I would say that life and doctrine, most of the doctrine has to do with just the way that you live and how you treat people and how you relate to God. But there are some theological doctrines that are really important.
Mm-hmm.
Some the
Like what?
Bible doesn't say enough about for us to even know, what are angels like
Mm-hmm.
exactly? What do they do exactly? The Bible doesn't answer some of those questions.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that it deals with a lot from a theological standpoint would be even how we get saved
Mm-hmm.
and what's necessary, because the early church was Jewish in nature when it started.
Mm-hmm.
And as they converted the non Jews, which were called Gentiles, meaning nations,
Mm-hmm.
as they converted people outside the Jewish family, there were those in the church who were Jewish who were saying that the Gentiles had to do the same things that the Jews did. They
Mm-hmm.
had to observe Judaism. And that became a big issue in the early church. Paul wrote Romans and Galatians. He appealed to it in Ephesians and other places. So there were theological doctrines, but
Mm-hmm.
the word doctrine just means teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Long answer to a
Long
good
answer.
question.
Right. So on a day-to-day, let's say for a young person
Mm-hmm.
who is in their early 20s in 2022,
Okay.
it could be difficult in many ways to be a Christian and to, align your life and doctrine closely, what would you say are practicals that you could do that keep it aligned, would you say?
Well, for one thing, we need to read the Bible. So
Right.
we need to know what it actually says, because there's a lot of opinion swapping that goes on, and people who think they know the Bible don't know the Bible. They know the opinions that they've heard, and that's just about it.
Right.
So reading it is one thing, and then dealing with the things that you find hard to accept,
Mm-hmm.
because young people are highly opinionated. I used to tell your father when he was about 16, son, please write your book now while you still know everything.
Yeah.
Because as you get older, you're not going to know as much as you thought you did.
Yeah. That's a dead giveaway on autobiographies. It's how good it is. It kind of determines on how young they were when they wrote it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So they say you should never write a book till you're at least 40. I don't agree with that, but I was 50, so there
Mhm.
you go.
Yeah.
But I think because we are opinionated, I do think we need to read, and then the things that we find difficult, we need to ask a lot of questions and have a lot of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, there are no bad questions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might sound to somebody a bit outlandish that someone would even think of a certain question, but if it's a genuine question, ask it.
Mm-hmm.
If something doesn't make sense to you that you're reading in the Bible, ask the question of someone, and then do some study on your own.
Right.
I mean, I can give you my opinion about what I think a certain thing means, but do your own study on that. There's study guides available. There are ways that you can look up things on online and in books and all of that. So I just think young people have questions, and they need to ask them, and they need to get some answers that make sense, and keep asking and probing until they do make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it starts with explicitly reading the Bible, not going into, you know, other avenues that could be supplementary and
Yeah,
complementary
right,
to biblical knowledge.
right.
But going to the source is important. I know
Yeah,
that that's what you've said before.
and that's true of pretty much everything. You need to go to the original source if you're going to find out about it.
Right.
Wikipedia doesn't have everything right.
Yeah.
And social media flat out doesn't have everything right.
Yeah.
If you base your belief spiritually on what you read on Facebook,
Yeah.
oh goodness gracious, you're going to have some difficulties.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could watch YouTube videos on how to throw a football, but the Cowboys won't be signing us this week.
Good way to put it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. That's true.
you have a sense of humor to go with your
Yeah.
questions.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Yeah.
Very good.
And, I started in 2020. I tried to read the Bible every year. So I've read it about 3 times now.
Good.
And you see, um, you can kind of notice the difference between the Old and the New Testament.
Hmm.
And specifically in the New Testament, on the topic of salvation, you see from the Gospels and then into the epistles of these passages explaining baptism,
Hmm.
and it point blank, tells it many, many times
Hmm.
in the end of the Gospels and then definitely in the beginning of the epistles. Why do
Hmm.
you think it is difficult for people to still kind of look at that and say, this is, it could be out of context, or I'm going to just ignore that when it
Yeah.
says explicitly, right? Because salvation is a very, um, it could be complicated. It shouldn't be.
Right.
I think the Bible shouldn't be complicated,
Right.
but it kind of still is when it comes to salvation and especially baptism,
Right.
because every denomination, every church kind of does their own spin on it.
Right.
Babies being baptized, 7 to 10-year-olds being baptized, and that's
Right.
just perfectly fine with them. And then, kind of with our avenue and our way of doing it is
Hmm.
for them to fully understand it and to fully grasp
Hmm.
what a relationship with God is before the baptism.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Well, that to me is one of the big mysteries,
right.
because to me it's cut and dried. In the book, I have one chapter on the conversion process specifically, And I tried just to go through Acts because Acts has the examples of people doing it, what they were told to do, why they were told to do it. I mean, it spells it out. So I've always been mystified with why is this complicated? My experience is this: I've studied the Bible with hundreds of people. I have never yet had anyone who was of the sort of unchurched, untaught, untrained, don't know the Bible. I've never had anyone ever have a problem with baptism when we studied that. The ones that have the problem are the ones who have been mistaught. And so you have to unteach and then teach rather than just teach.
Right.
And so some people have no problem with it. They read it and they say, wow, that's not what my church teaches. I need to do it this way. And then I have other people that look at it and say, well, we have a different view of that, and I think we're fine. And I don't know. I tried to explain some things about that, how the devil would try to make us work on that. But then, as I explained in the book too, I know people that are very serious about God and all that, but they still don't quite get the baptism thing. And then sometimes they get it later. I remember studying with one couple. The woman was the more dominant voice in the couple, and she just got mad about studying baptism. She got mad, walked out, said, "That's it. We're done. We're not coming to this church. I want to talk to you," and left. 1 year later, she called me up. She said, I, I kept looking at those passages that you taught us. And she said, I can't get around them. And I'm tired of trying. And I want to get together. And I want to get baptized the way the Bible teaches it. So sometimes it just takes people a longer time. I just try to keep sowing the seed, reasoning with people, and praying about it and letting God work it out. And then if they meet God before they do what I would have them to do, because of what the Bible, I think, teaches, then God will have to judge that. And that was one of the points in the book. And the postscript is, in the end of the day, I'm always going to teach what I believe the Bible is clearly teaching, but I'm going to let God be the judge on the day of judgment. Not that I have any choice of that or want any choice of that. I'm glad he is the judge.
Yeah. It puts the weight off the shoulders. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you think it just almost, it could be solely that they just have never read particular, books in the Bible that say it. So this is, sometimes it might be their first time reading it, and is an eye-opening thing. So you would you say it's more just not knowing, or knowing and being anti?
I think it's not knowing, because in their churches it's not emphasized at all. And so whatever their church does, they just assume that it's right because they've not studied it out for themselves. And so whatever's taught, they just accept, well, that's the way it is. And I know of people that have followed that path exactly. They've decided at some point, okay, I'm going to question it. And then they do. And then they say, good grief. How do they do that? There's a woman on Facebook that I met as a college kid, and her roommate, they were in a religious college. Her room, and they were pretty serious about it too. The two girls were. Her roommate got baptized. She came to see me, and she was mad as everything. She said, "Why did you baptize my roommate? She's already a Christian. She's right with God. Why did you do that?"
Right.
And so I said, "You really want to know? You want to take a look at the Bible?" She said, "Yeah." So we did. And so that shook her some. And she thought, well, seems right. But I don't understand why our church isn't teaching this. So I need to talk to my pastor. And I said, okay, here's what he's going to say. I'll just tell you exactly what he's going to say because I know your church group. And I told her, here's what he'll say, but go ask him. By all means, go ask him.
Yeah.
So I went on a trip to preach. That was back before cell phones, a long time before then. But I called her that night, and she answered the phone, and I said, "So did you meet with your pastor?" She said, "I did." She said, "I asked him all the questions that I had, and I said, 'What did he say?' And she said, 'He said exactly what you predicted he would say.' And I told him, 'I'm out of here.'"
Wow.
And so she got baptized, and I still see her on Facebook. She's still very faithful and
Oh, wow. Great.
doing well. But, sometimes it takes different people longer,
Hmm.
and we just have to be willing to work with that and keep working with it,
And to be faithfully patient.
and to be very patient, like God has been with us, right?
Right.
Okay, so that kind of winds down the time that we have, but
Yeah.
thank you for being with me, bud.
Yeah. We should go fishing and tell riddles next time.
Maybe we'll do that. But
Yeah.
you had some very good questions. Thank you for reading the book, number one, and
Mhm.
thank you for being a part of this today. And thank you for being such an encouragement to me when I was in the hospital thinking I might die anytime.
Oh, my honor.